Environmental science needs to go beyond just describing the problem and also help working towards solutions. Most microplastics in the environment are really coming from this fragmentation of macroplastics. I think that we're not quite at the state of the science to exactly say XYZ is really the problem. Which are the scenarios where we can really not live without plastics, and which are those scenarios where we may be able to reduce? I'm not anti-plastic, but I do think that we need to have a smarter way to be able to use and deal with these materials throughout their entire life cycle.
That is Denise Mitrano, Assistant Professor in the Environmental Systems Science Department at ETH Zurich. Trained as an environmental analytical chemist, Denise focuses on the impacts of anthropogenic materials in technical and environmental systems, in particular the analytics, transport, fate, and legislation around plastic pollution. She is passionate about finding new creative ways to protect the environment against pollutants of emerging concern by understanding the how and finding out where we can replace and reduce their sources in our day-to-day lives. My name is Peter Marcus Bach, and this is the Grand Challenges Podcast, a show about inspiring individuals who are stepping up to tackle the global challenges that our world is facing in their own unique ways. We reflect on the many out-of-the-box ways our guests have navigated the complexity and intricacies of the environment at the cutting edges of science, engineering, technology, and design. On today's show, Denise and I touch upon the topic of plastic pollution, from macro and micro to nano. We discuss the sources, some initiatives to reduce plastics entering the environment, and the challenges that the science will face in the coming years. We also reflect on whether a plastic-free world is possible and what realistic scenarios we can expect for both environmental and human health protection, and the role of science in future legislation. Detailed information is provided in the show notes over at peterandbach.com/podcast. Thank you for joining us today, and please enjoy the show. Summer in Switzerland this year is not exactly the easiest to deal with, especially with lack of ventilation and tramps passing out behind your door while you're trying to record a podcast. But nevertheless, welcome to the show, Denise.
Thanks for having me.
It's good to finally sit down and chat about a topic that I've been recently getting into as part of my work, maybe more so from the spatial planning side rather than the chemistry side. But to have you on the other side of the table to talk a bit about your experience in the area of microplastics, nanoplastics, anything of that sort, I think will be very interesting for our listeners because we've never really had this topic on the show. It's been alluded to a few times, but nice to finally go deep into it.
Yeah, and I'm really glad to be able to be here and that we can shed some light on this area that has only been alluded to so far in some of the other episodes.
No, definitely. But one other thing I must say that has been alluded to, actually I've alluded to you in a previous episode, not by name, and that was when I was talking to one of my guests, John Hathaway, from episode 24. We were actually chatting about cycling. He loves cycling, and I was telling him about the time I heard someone would cycle across the hills in Zurich to get to the Swiss Federal Institute of Aquatic Science and Technology on a day-to-day basis. And that was when I heard you were doing that back when both of us were still there. I thought that was quite a lot of physical exercise on a daily basis.
Well, at first it seemed like a lot of exercise, but I guess when we actually think about it, well, the listeners can decide if it's a lot or not, but it's about 7K each way with a few hundred meters elevation gain each way. So I think it was good training exercises for when I'm doing a lot more cycling in my off time.
Well, I think it's the elevation that puts me off. I like flat roads when I cycle, but even then, it's amazing. But you are someone who loves the outdoors quite a lot. And as far as I understand, you spend your summer vacations not relaxing on the beach, but being more active.
Yeah, definitely. I get a little bit antsy if I have to sit still for too long. So I'm oftentimes also not taking so much summer vacation because for me, it's too hot. So I'd rather go in spring, fall, winter, anything to be outside and in the wilderness. I feel like we're so switched on all the time at work. The main point of my vacations is to be able to be alone in the wilderness and really trying to cut off and disconnect.
I find that when I'm around nature, I do disconnect in a way. Maybe not in an active sense, but yeah, I do like going for walks around rivers, around forested areas, or at least green areas to get some shut mind, if you want to call it that. But you had a very interesting philosophy, which is that you like to be, I guess, uncomfortable outside your comfort zone, at least out in the wilderness.
Yeah, I think that oftentimes when we're just in the office and in the city living in Zurich, it's super comfortable, high standard of living here in Switzerland and in Zurich. And sometimes I feel like I get a little bit lazy if I'm just sitting at my desk or on the couch. So I'm always trying to have at least 14 nights a year in a tent, which is, I think, more or less have been able to accomplish for the last years. I think it can be a little bit uncomfortable and cold, but it's kind of a way to push yourself. And it's also when I do these long distance bike tours or go ski touring for multiple days, it's really a way to, kind of also push your physical limits and not just your mental limits.
14 nights in a tent, that's like 2 weeks. Do you do it in one go or do you...
It depends. It depends. I mean, since I've gotten a lot busier and a lot of my bike tours have also been more and more at hostels and hotels, sometimes it's a little bit on weekends, or even the last time that I was home, I took my tent and camped in my sister's backyard to make sure that I could get my 14 nights. I think my sister thought she was a bad host, but I told her, no, it's not about you. It's about me. It's about me. I need to just try to, be outside a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that's a very nice philosophy. I guess it reminds me of the Stoic philosophy from ancient Greek times, where they also talk about this idea of finding comfort in discomfort. And I guess with the challenging world of research and academia, I think that's something we need to get used to at times, because sometimes your research doesn't go the way it wants, you don't get the grant you want. I think we have lots of different stories from previous episodes, but I'm sure you have a lot of inspiring things to share on today's episode as well. So looking forward to getting into that. And I guess one quote that I really caught on to, hearing it from you, is that your approach is really, it's not about just describing the problem, but really solving it. And that it seems to be too common nowadays in academia that many researchers actually try to describe it, and then they forget that there's actually a whole lot of work to be done around solving the problem.
Well, I think it also is highly contextual on the type of field and research that you're doing. I think there's totally a place for fundamental science, and fundamental science should be supported and funded as well. But when we're actually talking about these areas of environmental pollution or other aspects that have a changeable aspect to them, then that is really where environmental science needs to go beyond just describing the problem and also help working towards solutions.
And in a way, environmental science, especially chemistry, geochemistry, that's where you got into in your PhD at Colorado School of Mines, which you finished back in 2012. And what inspired you to go into the environment in the first place, other than the camping?
Yeah. So it actually started when I was doing my bachelor's in Rhode Island at Salve Regina University. And I got a really nice opportunity to do a summer exchange in the mountains in Colorado. So to be honest, the first thing that I thought when I went there is like, I just need to get to move to Colorado. And then what can I actually do here? And when I heard the topic of geochemistry, I thought that this was a nice way to be able to both be outside and work on a lot of the analytical chemistry and method development that I was doing already during my bachelor's projects. So this is what kind of got me interested. And in the Western U.S., there's been a lot of legacy issues with the mining problems. And so I had initially thought, okay, great, I can get out into the mountains and start to understand a little bit more about remediating some of these mine sites or looking at different Superfund sites, which there are in the U.S. So looking mostly at metals toxicity in these different environments.
What an interesting coincidence, because in a way I'm somehow semi-associated with this whole topic of mines as well, because from my end, a lot of these mine sites will eventually become abandoned. And the question is, what do you do with the legacy? Can you rehabilitate them in a way that makes sense? So interesting connection that I didn't realize until now. So,
But I didn't get to actually work on the mines too much. The funding in the US goes a little bit different sometimes than in Europe.
Okay.
So I was able to go to the university and we started to look for projects where I could actually do this aspect that I really wanted to be able to do, that my PhD advisor was also historically doing a lot. But then after a year and a half, there was not as much funding for that topic as we had hoped.
No.
So I had to totally switch to a new field of research, which I didn't know anything about, which was engineered nanomaterials. And so it was finding different analytical techniques to be able to measure these engineered nanomaterials, which are very small, nano size, inorganic particles that are used in lots of different consumer products. And we were wondering if these were released to the environment, how would they distribute? How would they transform? How would they change their physiochemistry? What biological interactions might they have? But before we could answer those questions, we first needed to be able to measure them. And so that was really the task of my PhD.
And I guess if we think back to 2008 to 2012, this idea of nano, I guess, was probably seen more on the biological side, but less in the engineering. And it was starting to emerge because we were starting to get some technology that allowed us to even deal with this kind of size of material. I've always heard of micro materials and micro products working at the microscopic level, but I felt like nanotech felt like sci-fi at the time, which is now becoming a lot more feasible.
Yeah, so I don't think that nanotech only started in this area of 2008 to 2012 when I got the PhD, but I think that it was one of the instances where a lot of people wanted to learn from mistakes of the past, saying we do have this new material. So when we know that it's going to increase in production, how can we do environmental health and safety and safe and sustainable by design, already including that into how we envision to be able to use these products? Yeah. So that is a really nice transition about a little bit more forward thinking about use of chemicals and materials than there had been in previous times since chemical industries started.
So what would be an example of an engineered nanomaterial, like a day-to-day use?
So it's in a lot of sunscreens, for example, titanium dioxide, sometimes zinc oxide. It is reflecting the sun instead of having these organic chemicals, which have been proven to be a bit more toxic or unhealthy for marine life in specific, but also a lot of other aspects. We worked a lot also on silver nanomaterials that are incorporated into textiles as an antimicrobial agent. They're also in advanced electronics with quantum dots that are in TVs or in different types of displays. And when we were looking at which of these chemicals or which of these materials might be of interest, of course, we look at the material themselves, but also the whole life cycle of the product. You can imagine that if you have a sunscreen on you and then you jump in the lake, that is a direct way of releasing these engineered nanomaterials into the lake. But the chances that your TV is going to end in the lake, hopefully, is not very high. So there's a different life cycle that we need to look at about the health and safety implications about when these materials are used in different places.
Yeah, I've certainly seen, I think, videos of people throwing their TVs out of windows, but I'm pretty sure they're not going to end up in the lake.
When were you throwing your TV out of a window?
I have to go look up one of these videos. But for some reason, that popped into my mind as you were explaining that.
Okay, then we need to revise our risk assessment if people are throwing their TVs out windows.
But I guess, life cycle from when you manufacture it to using the product, you're starting to make me feel guilty about all the sunscreen I used in the last weeks on vacation in the ocean, all the way through to the fate in the environment. And I guess a lot of these, call it contaminants or materials, are grouped under this category of contaminants of emerging concern. Kind of reminds me about the start of my journey in stormwater, where I began in water quality. And back in the day, it was all about looking at sediments and suspended solids and a few nutrients. And then eventually you start to look at the metals because they come off the cars and many other sources. Bacterial, microbial activity as well because of bathing water quality. And now we're looking at pharmaceuticals and microplastics in this particular case. But I guess contaminants of emerging concern. So these are pollutants that have been detected in the environment that may cause ecological or human health impacts, and they're typically not regulated under current environmental laws. So how do we deal with them in the environment? Like, what makes us start to look at them? Is it because we found one particular case of, say, sunscreen actually causing marine life kills?
I think that it depends on the chemical. And sometimes you don't know until you see the problem. I mean, one example from the area of microplastics, nanoplastics, is this 6-ppd quinone, which was leaching out of tire wear particles. And then there was a specific instance where there was a lot of salmon that were impacted and there was salmon kills. And then folks said, okay, this is something that we need to look at more stringently. Other times, for the example of PFAS, it was produced for a much longer time, and only later, when there were more obvious human health impacts, would they start to look in a little bit closer and say, wait, where are all these human health impacts coming from? And then it was found to be the PFAS. So I think that it can kind of depend.
So we're dealing with a very, tricky situation where at times we will notice this immediately because something grand and terrible happens and it's on the news, I guess. I guess we have the media to thank for some of this, and I'm sure we'll get into that topic as well. And then other times it just shows up after years and years of neglect or years and years of ignorance, I guess, in this particular case of PFAS.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a question about how much was known when this material was being produced or not.
Yeah.
So, it is on a case-by-case basis as well, because the companies should also be doing some sort of environmental or toxicological health testing to make sure that what they're producing is actually okay.
Yeah.
And it's sometimes a little bit hard for us a priori to know if they've done their due diligence.
Yeah.
So a little bit of a chicken and the egg situation sometimes.
I guess corporate sustainability, we've mentioned this idea of greenwashing on previous episodes of the show as well, and there's always that danger. But I guess it's this, as you said, chicken and egg, but it's also this, trust and distrust kind of story between large corporations and, the researchers and the public.
Yeah. I think that with all these different stakeholders that are involved, it's never very easy to trust the other side. But that's where I think that a lot of progress is also being made, also in the area of plastics pollution. I hope that not too many companies will explicitly greenwash anymore, even though that is still happening in some cases. But I do think that the scale of the problem is really activating a lot of people into action.
Yeah, and looking forward to seeing where that moves as we progress, because I think the whole story around plastics is one that in itself has a lot of history, and that's really close to your heart. So you did engineer nanomaterials in your PhD at Colorado School of Mines. You had that exposure to environmental chemistry. You could see the world of, I guess, nanomaterials. But then you're in Switzerland. So how did you go from engineering nanomaterials to microplastics research in Switzerland?
Yeah, so it wasn't exactly a direct link, and it came in a few stages. So when I finished my PhD, I just really wanted to move to Europe. I wanted to find a postdoc to be able to move to Europe. But I got very lucky to be able to start to work at EMPA, which is the Swiss Federal Institute for Material Science and Technology, where I looked at the release of engineered nanomaterials directly from different consumer products. And I got quite interested in this aspect of life cycle assessment and understanding the life cycle of different products. After working at EMPA for a few years, I thought that, okay, I need to do something a little bit different than engineered nanomaterials, but my expertise is really in this area of particle characterization, particle fate and transport. And at that time, microplastics was not a very big topic. So I thought, okay, this is a nice place to use my skill set on a new emerging contaminant. And so I applied for a grant, a Swiss grant, to be able to start my own research group in this topic, which was granted in 2016, and then moved over to EOVAG, where we met.
Yep.
So this was able to bring this expertise of particle analysis into a new field and make a little bit of a bridge.
And in a way has then been building and building even up to now, where we're now sitting at ETH Zurich with this summer weather and the trams passing by, having this nice deep dive into microplastics. So maybe a bit of 101. So when we think about plastics, there are these words being thrown around: macroplastic, microplastic, nanoplastic. I remember seeing a funny illustration of some person with a beach ball and calling that beach ball a spherical macroplastic. But from your own experience and in your own words, how would you define or teach this field to someone who doesn't know anything about the whole issue of plastics in the environment?
Right. So when we look at plastic pollution, it's on a size continuum of lots of different sizes of plastics. And this size is really indicative of how it can be transported in the environment, as well as the biological impacts that it might have. There are a few simple numbers that are normally thresholds for what is a different size plastic. So those plastic pieces that are over 5 millimeters in size, which is a lot of plastic, is called macroplastic.
Okay.
Microplastic is less than 5 millimeters in size, and nanoplastic is often defined as particles that are less than 1 micron in size. So when a piece of plastic trash gets into the environment, whether it be a soda bottle or a plastic bag, this is initially a macroplastic, but over time, through UV and mechanical stress, this can break down and fragment into smaller and smaller size fractions, microplastics and nanoplastics. And this is where the vast majority of plastics, microplastics and nanoplastics, come from in the environment.
And I guess that's what makes the field very interesting, because you throw a water bottle or a plastic bottle into the lake, call it microplastic, and it's pretty big. Eventually, as you said, mechanical degradation or UV rays will degrade that material and fragments might break off it, maybe rocks will knock it, and therefore you end up with smaller pieces. And these may still be microplastics. But then over time, these things will crumble and much smaller microscopic pieces will dislodge. And then this is where we start to get into the micro and nanoplastic ranges. And I guess what makes it extremely interesting and why it's really relevant is because at these sizes, they can be ingested by fish. They can cause some serious changes to algal compositions in lakes. Even humans can ingest them by accident if we're swimming in the lake that's polluted. And that's where I guess a lot of the research then has to spend time into understanding what the impacts then are for us.
Yes, yeah. I would say at each size class, there's different hazards. I mean, if it's large macroplastic, it's a fishing net, something like this, there can be a lot of entanglement of wildlife. But as the smaller the particles are, the easier it is for organisms to be able to ingest them.
Yeah. And I guess the more common one that seems to be very prevalent across Europe is the microplastics coming from tire wear. So cars driving off highways, that plastic dislodging from the tire. But then the question is, tires are made out of rubber. Would we class these as microplastics?
Yes. So tire wear is also still considered a microplastic because of its composition. So it's not necessarily clear what is the major source of microplastics in general. Tire wear is one big portion, but there's also release of microplastic fibers from synthetic textiles, as well as mismanaged waste. So each of these different types of materials will have, again, a different life cycle, also be composed of different types of polymers, but importantly, also have different plastic added chemicals.
Yep.
So some of these plastic added chemicals are added on purpose, either organic chemicals or metals that might be added to plastics for different functionalities or colorants. And these plastic added chemicals can also leach over time. So it is still also a question about where are the impacts coming from? Is it from these particles themselves? Is it from the leaching of the plastic added chemicals? Is it some sort of combination? Does it depend on the context? So still there is really a lot of open questions and directions to follow.
I guess this is sort of also referring to a really nice perspective that you wrote. When we think of these kinds of polymers, as you mentioned, they are in kind of different states and different forms in the environment. And some of them are not necessarily harmful at all, right? They can potentially help environmental processes by inhibiting something far worse. So I guess not all these polymers are necessarily going to be lethal or toxic, but some of them are, and it's about understanding what each of them are going to contribute in terms of environmental degradation, ecological health, human health.
So I feel like with this area, now we go into a different aspect where so far we've been talking about mismanaged plastics waste, which breaks down in the environment. This is something that we call secondary microplastics. However, there's also another category of microplastics, which may also end up in the environment, called primary microplastics. These are small particles that are directly added to different types of products for a different functionality, and then they may also be released to the environment over time. So some examples of this might be like scrubber beads that you have in body wash, but also can be other things like seed coatings on seeds that are used in agriculture or agrofertilizers that have a polymer scaffolding that actually has the active ingredient on it. And so when you talk about these different uses of plastic, sometimes these can still serve a necessary function that will help the situation. So when we think about seed coatings, this is protecting the seed for longevity. It can maybe give it more nutrients or things as it's starting to germinate. And so this can be a positive aspect for agriculture. Yet we have to also still weigh if that positive benefit for this seed growing is outweighed by the potential environmental consequences of directly adding plastics to the environment. So this is always really contextual on the case study. So with this case of microplastics that are added as scrubbers in body washes, there may be other technological solutions to be able to have the same function, but without having the polymer there. This can be a lot of different options that are technologically feasible and also economically viable. So we always need to weigh these different factors what is the technology that we want to be able to have? What is the economics, which is able to have us be able to use this in a scaled up way? And what is the environmental impact? So I think this is the case across all of plastics, not just microplastics, is understanding which are the scenarios where we can really not live without plastics, and which are those scenarios where we may be able to reduce.
Yeah. And I guess there's two very famous movements or examples that sort of show that kind of situation that you just described. One of them, exactly as you just mentioned, these beads in washing products, which I think have been banned now across Europe and perhaps I think even Australia at some point. But I remember the times when they came out, and I think I remember using one, and I thought this is awkward. But it seems that the only purpose they ever served was that kind of cleaning purpose, the abrasiveness on the skin that allowed you to, for whatever reason, achieve a much better cleanliness compared to other products.
It's exfoliation.
Oh,
your skin is very radiant and beautiful. You must exfoliate all the time, even if it's not with microplastics, Peter.
I was going to say, I could also take it just as a normal sponge to do that.
Yes, well, that's another solution.
Well, there we go. Okay, so that was the actual term. Sorry, I'm not the beauty product expert, but seems like that has caused a lot of concern for the environmental reasons and therefore led to their ban in these kinds of products.
But in this case, also, a lot of companies voluntarily converted their formulations because there was this concern. And then companies thought, okay, if we can then now place a sticker on the front of our bottle saying microplastic free, this is technologically and economically viable for us to do. And it also, gains us some brownie points with the consumers. So there was quite a lot of voluntary conversion for these types of cosmetics, but primary microplastics are used in a lot of other contexts as well. And this is where the regulation really starts to step in.
Yeah. And in a way, a voluntary approach, there was an incentive in a way, also given, I guess, a lot of the media attention that these beads got, these exfoliation beads got in the washing products. And the second example being the ban on plastic bags that seems to end up in the environment. I remember the cover of a famous National Geographic issue, which was a picture of an iceberg, but actually it was a plastic bag upside down, half submerged in water. I also remember a recent story I read in the news somewhere, which was where they found a plastic bag at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, it just shows you how pervasive these single-use plastic bags are, or at least the secondary products that result from them degrading in the environment.
Yeah. I mean, macroplastic as well as microplastic and nanoplastic have been found essentially in every environmental sample that has been taken so far. So it is really a global issue of the fate and transport of plastics across the globe.
Yeah. But I guess your philosophy, it seems like we're moving towards a plastic-free world, but your philosophy and I guess what shapes a lot of the groundwork as well is that you're not advocating for this plastic-free world. We may not be able to create an anti-plastic world because it seems essential for many of our other kinds of day-to-day processes. Could you shed a bit of light on that?
Yeah, indeed. I'm not anti-plastic, but I do think that we need to have a smarter way to be able to use and deal with these materials throughout their entire life cycle. So the first step is really still reducing plastics where we don't need it. I mean, some examples from microplastics are these scrubber beads or even with the plastic bags that you mentioned before. But I know that there is a lot of plastic packaging and plastic usage, especially single use, that can really be avoided. So reducing the primary production of plastics is really the first step in alleviating this plastic pollution crisis. But there are other steps in the life cycle as well. When we especially think about waste management, we can have different ways to collect and manage the waste. Recycling may be one portion of that, but certainly being able to just collect waste and not have it freely released into the environment is another portion that we need to think of.
I guess if we think, to classical environmental pollution, it's about source control. And in this case, they just originate from the fact that we don't manage our waste correctly. Much like if we think in stormwater and nutrients, it comes from the catchments, the elevated levels coming from catchments that are highly urbanized instead of trying to hold that back. So yeah, waste management. But what are some ways we can deal with that in cities dealing with their wastes?
I'd say when we are thinking about controlling macroplastic waste into the environment, this is really the key place where we're going to be able to reduce microplastic formation and transport throughout the environment. So stopping this macroplastic waste is really important. However, there are some times that microplastics release is going to be eventually unavoidable. When we took this case of tire wear particles, you're driving your car, you're naturally going to release some of this rubber. So there we need to take a slightly different approach. We know that it's going to end up in the environment, or at least in the stormwater, and then you can help us take care of it in the stormwater. But when we think about having these tire wear particles, we can take a different approach and actually see which are the different chemicals or materials that are in this tire wear, and how we can work with the companies to optimize this tire wear that we know will eventually be in the environment, to not have toxic chemicals or not have toxic metals that are actually included in the product. Because in these cases, this waste material, the tire wear particles, are essentially going to be unavoidably lost.
I guess it's true in the end. You can't really all of a sudden make tires out of something that's not plastic or, that material, because they do have a functional component, which is that grip on the surface of the roads. I guess magnetic levitation is nowhere near mature yet. So, I guess to deal with that, then we're going to have to create better understanding of what the effects are, what the risks are, and how we just manage that, or how we can deal with it once it's released to the environment. And this is where a lot of your research then is shaped around really 3 big pillars. We generally don't want the plastics in the environment or our bodies, but we also don't really know what the risks are, what the hazard is, and how exposed we are to it. And when we think tire wear, highways are out in the middle of nowhere half the time, and that's where most of the tire wear occurs, because they're going at high speeds and that material gets warmed up, just to illustrate that case. But there is a bit of a back and forth between what the risk is really showing and what the media is saying as well. There's a lot of sensationalism still in the media as well, right?
Yeah. So the media attention is really important for the plastics issue because it's gained a lot of awareness. Mm-hmm. That being said, I think that a lot of times these headlines might be a little overstated and a little hyperbolic to be able to get readers to be able to dig into the topic a little bit more. And so while there certainly are negative impacts of plastic pollution in the environment and on us and in our bodies, I think that we're not quite at the state of the science to exactly say XYZ is really the problem. And so that's where more research is really needed.
Yeah.
So in our group, we have 3 different pillars of research that we specifically want to target to be able to illuminate some of these answers. The first is analytical method development and particle characterization.
Understanding the chemistry of the particle itself and how it looks like, what it's composed of.
So when we talk about characterization, especially of microplastics and nanoplastics, there are a few key things that we want to be able to know about these particles. First is which polymer that they're made up of, if there's any chemicals or metals that are inside them, what is their size, what is their shape, are they a fiber, are they a fragment, are they a sphere, and really being able to say, okay, here's the material that's in our sample and what is actually contained in it. Of course, a lot of microplastics are not just out there free in the environment. They're actually in soil or in water. So part of this analytical characterization is also getting the material in a state that we can then further analyze it. So this is the entire analytical chain which we're investigating. How do we take our samples? How do we extract the microplastics from their environmental or biological matrix? And eventually, how do we chemically and physically characterize them to be able to say what was actually in our sample?
Just listening to how you're approaching it, it reminds me about how they do some of these characterizations with tire wear particles, where they either collect samples of these particles along highways, or they actually simulate the wear of a tire in a lab, which is quite interesting, apparently, when you read about it. But they really look into what are the potential byproducts that are formed from the microplastics that come off tires. What are the different agents they use, and do they actually get this lodged? And what is that really, that soup of different chemistry that you find? Very, very interesting. But at the same time, I'm someone who shies away from all these crazy chemical symbols, especially organic chemistry. But it seems that there are so many possibilities around what can emerge from these kinds of materials that there's still a lot of work that can be done.
Yeah, I mean, plastic pollution is really a heterogeneous group of materials. And so that's what also makes this analytical chain really challenging, because it's not like we're looking for one specific right answer. There can be 1,000 right answers of what the microplastics are in a given sample. And so that's where we need to have really accurate and precise analytical measurements across the entire chain.
And a lot of these also have very complicated chemical names. I remember learning about organic chemistry and that there's actually a system to it, but definitely something, lots of respect from my side in the work that you do in that department, because I know you can go very deep very quickly. Probably something that's much closer to, I guess, my level of understanding, and also, where I feel my role as a stormwater engineer or as urban planner and aspiring architect, as I've mentioned on some other episodes, is really around the environmental aspect. Once it's released into the environment, you do a lot around the fate, the transport, the interaction of these microplastics with the environment.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the second pillar of our research, which is the largest and broadest pillar of what we do. And as you said, it's the fate, transport, and biological interactions of microplastics and nanoplastics. So we work in a few different environmental compartments, both water and soil, as well as different technical systems. We haven't worked in stormwater yet, but this is where hopefully our collaborations will pull off. But we've worked with wastewater treatment plants and drinking water treatment plants to see how these different particles can be removed. In addition to just how plastics are moving through the environment, going from A to B, we also try to look at the impacts that are there. So not just are the plastics there, but what negative environmental consequences are there from having these plastics in these systems.
Yeah, and in a way, one example we already mentioned previously was how the tire wear particles affect salmon species, and that's sort of what gave them a bit of media attention. But I guess especially in the wastewater treatment and the drinking water treatment, we need to consider both kinds of processes, because not all these plastics may be removed in the wastewater. So they will end up in the rivers, and it's these very same rivers where the water is then extracted somewhere further downstream for use in drinking water. But I guess from some of the studies, some of the key studies that you've done, you've actually looked at how certain filters are actually quite good at removing these particles. Maybe not perfect, but they actually do a pretty good job already.
Yeah, exactly. So both with the wastewater and the drinking water treatment plants, which are two totally different types of processes, we saw a really high level of removal using current technologies. So in the case of the drinking water treatment plant, together with the city of Zurich, we looked at the different stages of drinking water treatment, which had either sand filters or activated carbon filters, and saw how nanoplastics could be removed through how the system is already operating now. And we found quite efficient removal. Of course, we only tested one type of system and one type of plastic, so we can't say that this is necessarily 100% bulletproof. Maybe scientists can never say anything with 100% certainty. So, but we did find quite a high removal from drinking water treatment plants. With the wastewater treatment plants, we also saw a very high removal. About 95% of the plastics are removed with the sludge in wastewater treatment, but 5% are still emitted directly with the wastewater into the receiving water bodies. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the end of the line for plastics in this system, because oftentimes this sludge from wastewater treatment plant is used on agricultural fields as a nutrient amendment. And so this is where we have really this aspect of microplastics cycling in the environment, that it is going one place, but then can easily be moved to another place and cause a different type of hazard or exposure.
And I guess unlike many other typical contaminants, if we think certain metal species or certain microbial species, some will be inactivated through UV activity. I certainly remember when I did literature review on microbial water quality, that was a key process, whereas certain metal species might be taken up by plants and other kinds of living organisms because of them being an essential component. But these plastics, they sort of retain their chemical structures, albeit with slight modifications through the environment.
Yeah, I think that remediation of microplastics and nanoplastics is likely even more challenging than it is for a lot of other contaminants of emerging concern. This is because plastics are incredibly persistent, even though, of course, they may fragment over time to smaller particles. That actually probably makes them even more challenging to remove from the environment. And as you say, they are quite stable as well, although we do still see physical and chemical changes to the materials over time. But that's also what we're still investigating about how this weathering, this chemical changing or physical changing to the surface, how this really impacts the fate, transport, or biological interactions.
Yeah. But as you said, at least, in the short term, a good piece of news is that our current technologies are able to actually remove these compounds within wastewater as well as drinking water. I guess the longer term concern is then what do you do with the waste products from this treatment process, and how do you responsibly manage them, whether it's disposing them off or if you reuse them, having an awareness of how much is actually contained, how much microplastic or nanoplastic in this case is actually contained within these waste products like the sludge.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where really the two arms of our research profile that we've discussed so far, the analytics and the fate and transport, really become interlinked because in order to be able to know how much is there, you need to be able to measure.
That is true.
And as of now, there's really no standardized methods to be able to measure microplastics, especially in a fast enough way that would be in a monitoring type fashion. And so this is where these analytics, again, become really important to streamline this analytical chain so we can move more towards being able to monitor on a more regular basis.
I guess it takes a lot of time to get a sample and then to figure out what is actually in this sample in the lab. You'd have to do, this goes past my own head, but I think a lot of the chemical techniques you will need, they're going to require equipment that's quite expensive, not as easily obtainable. I don't think every environmental agency can just simply buy one. It's not like the days when we have turbidity sensors where you can just go in and see how much suspended solids is in a sample of water.
Yeah. One thing is the expense of the equipment itself, which can be limiting depending on which environmental agency that you're discussing. But the other is the scientific expertise of the people that are operating this, because it's really not just one number that you're getting at the end. Again, you're getting a lot of different types of plastics at a lot of different sizes. And so it's not necessarily easy to interpret the data. And so the scientific expertise behind interpreting these measurements are also more challenging than understanding some of the other environmental contaminants that are out there.
But a key piece of work that you've undertaken has allowed you to bridge the analytical techniques and the fate and transport. And you've developed a way of measuring these plastics in a much more easier way, and what you call metal-doped plastics. Could you tell me a bit more about these metal-doped plastics?
So as we've discussed, these analytical challenges of micro and nanoplastic analysis is really a crux of how we can start to be able to measure quickly and efficiently. Now, we're always going to have to improve analytics when we look at environmental systems, but when we're working in the laboratory, pilot scale, or mesocosm systems, we may be able to take a different approach, which will ease the analytical burden. So this is one of the foundations of our research group, that we can synthesize model microplastics and nanoplastics, which are easier and faster to measure. In our case, we have a trace metal that is inside the plastics, and we can measure this metal as a proxy for the plastics to be able to expedite the analysis.
So you somehow attach metal components to the plastic itself, like you make it undergo a process where you add a metal to its composition.
Yeah, so we don't attach it on the surface, but we put it on the inside during the synthesis of the plastic so that we can have the same characteristics of real plastics, but have a known amount of this metal inside. And the reason why we specifically use metals in this case is because there's a long history of trace metals analysis and a lot of different systems. So we can measure it quite at low concentrations and really efficiently. We can put in metals that are environmentally rare, so there's little background that is in our experimental test system. And we also test that this metal that we add doesn't change the physiochemical properties of the plastic or doesn't leach out, so it's still a conservative tracer over time. And so then we can put these model metal-doped plastics into a number of different test systems, and then we can avoid these really long and challenging analytical steps. So that allows us to really do process studies much easier because we can take many more samples and analyze them much faster than we would if we were just measuring the plastics themselves.
So in a way, it's making things more efficient by, I guess, preparing the plastics before you do any larger experiments where you then want to understand how they behave.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting approach, I guess, especially when there's a lot of uncertainty around how we're supposed to accurately detect these plastics in the environment or in experiments with new methods. And they can be quite costly as well, right? So I guess you go for the more cost-effective alternative by doing a slight modification at the start with the trace metals.
Yeah, the cost is, I would say it's more time than cost.
It's more time than cost,
yeah.
Okay.
I mean, time is money, so eventually it is cost as well.
Yeah.
But I would still say that it is very time efficient to be able to do this. And even using these metal doped plastics can help us streamline other parts of the analytical chain. So now we're doing some work about having an own system, for example, a small plot in an agricultural field, which we can put our metal-doped plastics in and then try different sampling techniques to be able to see what is the best way to sample and do we get a accurate and precise sampling of this field. We can also look at different purification techniques or extraction techniques of microplastics or nanoplastics from biological or environmental media. And by expediting the analytics, we can test many more parameters and be able to streamline the analytics using these model plastics so that when we actually go to the environment, then we would say, okay, this has already been a tested or validated method, and now we're ready to go to our environmental sample with a lot more confidence.
Yeah, no, it's very clever in a way, finding a way to do it in a time-efficient way, therefore then cost-efficient, using understanding that is quite rigorous, using traces that you will not find anywhere else, so that you're actually looking at the plastic and not something that's distorting your data in the end.
Yeah, exactly.
No, very, very clever. And in a way, the cornerstone that allowed you then to better understand and address the second pillar, really that fate and transport and the biological interaction in the environment.
And it seems that the whole issue of monitoring is also different.
Whether you're looking at microplastics in water or microplastics in soil. And you've also been looking a bit at the whole soil component, because that in itself brings with it a whole different combination of processes as well.
Yeah, but what's really nice about a lot of this aspect of microplastics and nanoplastics is I think that we already know a lot about particles that are in the environment. So we had already discussed, I worked in this area of engineered nanomaterials previously, and some of those same foundational quote-unquote rules of how particles are transporting through systems or interacting with biological organisms can be known from what we have already learned with engineered nanomaterials, and even other areas of science. When we look at fate and transport of other colloids, natural colloids, we may be able to use some of this information to predict how plastics might behave.
Okay. Well, I guess, with you can learn from other disciplines or learn from other arms within the same discipline. When you think at a much broader scale, water is more than just the environmental chemistry of it, or the hydrology, or the physical processes, or even just policy around it. So I think, no matter how specific a topic, taking the lenses from many disciplines will allow you to then learn and inspire new approaches within your own discipline.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I really like this aspect of plastics pollution, because I think it's a really great way to do transdisciplinary science, that we can look at a lot of different areas of natural science to be able to help us be informed about how particles might behave, but then also working with other stakeholders in the system. So it is a really varied and interesting area to be able to work.
And never a dull moment, definitely.
For sure not.
And that frames a lot of that third pillar that we can get into as well, and that is whatever gets measured can get managed. and you've done a lot of thinking and work around the policy, the regulation, the material design. What's your journey been there as an environmental chemist going into this kind of space? Do you collaborate? Do you work with the stakeholders, or do you try and take an objective scientist's lens towards this particular issue?
Well, I hope to always be objective, and I suppose I will always have a scientist lens by default. But it is always important to work with the other stakeholders, especially when we're thinking about policy and regulation, because science, I hope that policy and regulation will be science-based, but there are, of course, a lot of other factors which need to be considered, which are beyond my area of expertise since I'm not a politician. So I think that this cooperation is really important. So the type of work that I do in this space is varied and depends on the objective. So some of this is on the basic analytics, working with national labs or with other intergovernmental agencies to be able to streamline this analytical workflow and make standards and quality assurance controls throughout the whole analytics, but also working with other government agencies to be able to say, okay, there's a new proposed law. What do you think about this law? Is it being all-inclusive or not? For example, when we have been talking a lot about tire wear particles today, I was asked to review a piece of legislation to try to clean up tire wear particles specifically because of the heavy metals that could be leached out of the particles, specifically zinc, because there had been shown a lot of negative environmental effects with high zinc levels in waterways that are nearby to roads. And so this piece of legislation was trying to reduce the runoff of tire wear particles into roads. But it's not only about this analytics or about policy, but also working with the companies to say, okay, you want to make this product, you have maybe 10 different options about how to make this product, but let's us test which one of these is the most sustainable or environmentally safe and sound.
I guess painting the whole story again, using all the different techniques and knowledge developed along the way.
Yeah.
And as you said, like with the bath beads, with the soap, what did we call it again?
Well, exfoliation beads.
Like with the exfoliation beads, finding an alternative that does the same kind of job, but with a better environmental footprint as a result of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so where do you think we're at with regulations around microplastics?
So there's different aspects of regulation. We've already discussed some of the regulation that's been put in place for primary microplastics, those particles that are directly put into different products for certain purposes. The EU, US, UK, Australia, some other jurisdictions have already banned primary microplastics from a lot of products. But most microplastics in the environment are really coming from this fragmentation of macroplastics.
Yep.
And this is where we're eventually going to need something much bigger scale. And there's where the UN Plastics Treaty really starts to hopefully kick in to be able to have an international scale of better managing the plastics pollution issue. And not only the pollution, but all aspects of the life cycle of plastics, which also includes reduction of primary plastic.
I guess they say reduce, reuse, and recycle.
Yeah.
To quote, some wise words from many years ago, especially when I was a kid as well. I guess one of the simplest ways of thinking about it. Single use has been, I guess, a lot of the challenges around plastics. At least we always hear that word. And with the UN Plastic Treaty, hopefully, I think things will, shape themselves in future. Maybe not fully, anti-plastic, as you said. We don't need to. I think plastics should be essential in some form or another. But I guess moderation being the key. As they say, everything in moderation is always good. So what's in store for your work on microplastics going forward?
So there's still a lot of unanswered questions about plastic, microplastic, nanoplastic pollution research in many different areas, from the analytics to the fate and transport to the biological interactions. So unlike other fields of research, maybe like yours, where you're trying to develop a new stormwater system to clearly remove different pollutants or to be more effective, in the field of plastics pollution, the trajectories are always going to be different and more varied because we're going to get new information all the time, and then we can have to follow up these leads about where we find the most potential hazards in different environmental or biological systems. And so clearly we need to still improve analytics so that we can have more robust monitoring and understanding over time, because as we said before, if it's not measurable, it's eventually not going to be enforceable or fixable.
Yeah.
But in terms of environmental impacts, I think that there still can be many, and we're still trying to narrow down the scope of where we want to be able to focus most in the future.
I guess it's building that understanding continuously until we have the confidence to certainly say, these are the serious effects, these are the hazards, this is the likely risk. And I feel like risk characterization is something that's an ongoing thing. One day it seems like a huge risk, and the next day we find out something that sort of throws it up on its head. But a very dynamic field, I guess. And as we see more pollutants of emerging concern or contaminants of emerging concern arise, in our day-to-day, it also helps shape this particular research area.
Yeah, and I think the other aspect is that there are so many researchers that are now getting into this area of plastics pollution that we get a lot of different viewpoints from a lot of different people, and also a lot of different research tracks that people are following. And so it's still, even though it's in the news all the time, an early phase for really what are the impacts of plastic pollution. And so I think it's still a really exciting time to see how this research field will grow, but not, of course, only on which bad impacts there are, but working with other stakeholders to minimize the impacts in the future.
Yeah, but I think it will be exciting to see then, where it takes you as well. I guess, you seek the discomfort in your tent 14 days a year, and I guess that in a way trains you to also expect the unexpected in the research field that you're in. But I think never a dull moment would be maybe an appropriate saying at this point in time.
Yeah, never a dull moment. And certainly I try to personally be really flexible and also really build a lot of collaborations across different fields of science. And so even though I'm an analytical chemist and geochemist by training, I work a lot with different environmental engineers, biologists, nanoscientists, material scientists. And so never thinking that I'm the smartest person in the room is always really important, to be able to ask a lot of questions and really listen to other people's point of view to incorporate that into our research.
And that's a very beautiful mindset to have, because I think, we have to be humble in our approaches as researchers, because that then opens up the door to new collaborations, new knowledge, I guess, either validating things that we already know or invalidating it and teaching us new ways of looking at things. And I think that keeps the creativity fresh as well.
Yeah, you stole my word with creativity. I think that this is really where this having a lot of creativity and trying to think outside the box is really where we're going to push the field forward. Even with this aspect of this metal-doped plastics, maybe tracers have been used for a lot of different studies before, but not yet for plastics. And so by being able to speak with other scientists to help us produce the materials that we needed for our studies, we were able to really lay the foundations to push the field forward. And so this openness and creativity is really something that I try to keep fundamental to our research group.
And it seems that, you've been pretty instrumental in training young researchers and, helping them grow their research strengths and the openness to think outside the box, especially in these kinds of topics.
Yeah, I really, aside from the science itself, one of my favorite parts of being a professor here at ETH is being able to train the next generation of scientists. So this is really broadening the aspect of transdisciplinary research, but also science communication. And so every year I run a workshop specifically on science communication, and this has been a really enjoyable aspect of my work.
No, that's awesome. I find we need to train a lot of the young researchers in science communication much more, because at the end of the day, first of all, I think disciplines are getting more and more complex as time passes. We are being sought to go interdisciplinary more and more as we progress. And I think that's where communication becomes key. Learning to work with the correct terminology, to understand how different disciplines use these different terminologies.
And then how to simplify this knowledge for a general audience as well, because too often we can get lost in our own world.
Yeah, a big pillar of science communication is really how to simplify and deliver the message that you want for the specific audience at hand. So when I'm talking to public audiences, it's a very different conversation than maybe you and I are having now, which is still yet a different conversation than talking to somebody that is an analytical chemist. And so being able to target the right information with the correct level of detail to keep everybody engaged and understanding is really, a key foundation of scientific communication.
And I think it's a skill that needs to be taught a lot more. I think in academic training, I find sometimes we would benefit from having courses in the PhD programs or even just the master's programs in getting students to do that more actively.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah. Denise, it's been fascinating going into this world of microplastics and hearing about your journey, as well as a lot of the passion you have and dedication you're showing to the work and to training the next generation. Like I do with every guest on the show, I'd love to ask you a few key questions so that listeners can get to know a lot more about you. I guess it comes down to inspiration. What is that one inspiration that drives you forward to do what you do on a daily basis?
So there are really two aspects that really drive me. First, of course, with the science, being able to work on this interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary problem to have a better life cycle of materials and how they can reduce environmental impact is really important to me. But besides being a scientist, I still see my job at ETH as a professor, as an educator. And so by training my students both in science and in science communication, I think that my own personal footprint can grow wider by having this fundamental training of the next generation of scientists who will work in many different fields and hopefully be very successful to be able to reduce the negative impacts that people have on the environment.
Definitely very inspiring in a way that you're doing it for a particular reason, but you're also doing it to pass it on to the next generation of people. If you had a magic wand and you could change one thing about the current situation, the current world that we're in, or anything that you're dealing with, what would you change and why?
So I think that there's a lot of polarization that's happening in the world today. And this is true for sure, as we all know, about politics, but also happens in the world of science. And if we keep having this very big polarization between people and not having this openness and willingness to learn from other people and really listen to their stories and their expertise, I don't think that science will be able to move forward. And we also won't be able to move forward in other aspects of our lives. So still really trying to decrease polarization with more understanding would be what I would use my magic wand wave for.
What do you think is causing this polarization?
Ooh, this is now getting very existential. But but I mean, I think that many people want to believe that they are 100% right all the time, and that people also get very entrenched in their own circle of friends, their own media bubbles, and then this really doesn't open the door for openness between a lot of people. And I'm not immune to this myself, of course, but I really try to, take other people's opinions and standpoints as valid and not necessarily jump the gun by thinking that one way is better than another way. And even when it comes to this aspect of plastics pollution, right, there's oftentimes a bad guy and a good guy. And these bad guys are often considered the companies and the chemical manufacturers. But if we as scientists don't engage with them to be able to work with them to say, okay, this is what is really, truly bad, and you really need to change these different aspects of the products or the processes that you're doing, and just push them to a corner, then without that dialogue, we're not really going to be able to move forward.
And let's hope that the magic wand, in a way, I guess, can create even the smallest effect, that dialogue, that openness to listen to each other and to try and understand more perspectives rather than just our own. Was there a key moment, book, paper, or person that completely changed the course of your career or mindset?
Yeah, so I think that when I first got here to Switzerland, my postdoc advisor, Per Novak, was really influential on how I've conducted my career now. And so he's been a really great support for me. I mean, coming from America, maybe I was working, too much. And I had this very strong way of working, but, he kind of reinforced this idea of work smarter, not harder. And this allowed me to really have a bit more creativity, to have space and time for creativity if I'm not only working all the time. And so this is also where I've taken a little bit more of a work-life balance, or at least try to have a bit more of a work-life balance. But there's also this kind of American saying that's like, go big or go home. And so that is still something that I retain a lot. And so I think that having these two mantra is probably too strong of a word, but these two ideal sets that I try to have of go big or go home, but also work smarter, not harder, really kind of take the best of American and Swiss mentality to kind of have this creativity, but also productivity.
It's a bit of a conflict to see these two mantras go against each other, right? But I kind of agree. I think you need to work smarter, not harder, because otherwise you work yourself to the ground. But at the same time, I don't know, there's this constant push for productivity. I guess another word to describe it is this hustle culture. Everyone's like hustle, make sure you get stuff done. And I think striking a balance between the two is really where the sweet spot is. But I guess in relation to that as well, what strategies can you offer for time management? How do you maintain a balance between your profession and your personal time?
So my time management approaches have really evolved over time with my new role. So I became a lot more time efficient when I was still producing more primary science myself, still working in the lab, by being able to really look at the experimental matrix that I wanted to assess and really defining what are the key variables that I want to be able to look at. Mm-hmm. As I've progressed in my career and I've been more in a leadership role, I've really had to let go of control a lot more and being able to give tasks to other people that after I've trained them and trust them that they can overtake this task, to let go and let other people take over. And this really helps with time management for myself if I don't feel that I have to micromanage everything that's going on in my group.
And I guess that's often a very hard thing to do because you kind of have it in your head set what you want to do, but then the thought of, I guess, leaving it to someone else. I sometimes deal with this as well on a daily basis when I have to delegate as well.
Yeah. Sometimes it can be scary to delegate away something that you're very passionate about. But I've also found that when I do that, new ideas also emerge. And actually it's done normally differently than I would have done it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad.
Could be even better as well.
It could be even better, right? Yeah.
I had this discussion with many previous guests as well, and that the students themselves often come up with very new ways of thinking that we never would have thought about, using techniques that we would only wish that we knew how to use. I see this especially in the data analysis and the programming side, where I certainly know a bit of coding to help with data analysis, but I'm sure the students would come up with something even more amazing.
Yeah, I think that this aspect of coding and technological advances in that way, definitely the students are outpacing me.
No, definitely. And I guess we have to embrace it. We have to be guiding in that way and learning to relinquish control. I think too often we feel human nature wants to take over and we want to be in charge. What was one of the most challenging situations that you've ever faced in your career to date, and how did you overcome it?
So there are, of course, a lot of challenges that come with an academic career, and especially because it's a very competitive space and because people need to be productive at such a high rate. But I don't think that all of these challenges necessarily were hindering my career up until this point. Many challenges had to do with interpersonal differences or with aspects of women in science, but I really personally try not to dwell on these challenges too much and really try to overcome them more and be more satisfied and happy when I've overcome the challenges. And what I'm happy to see most is oftentimes with myself in this position when other students or coworkers see me overcome these different challenging situations, it also can provide a source of inspiration to not really just be complaining about my problems and say, well, XYZ bad thing happened to me, but that other people can see that this is a positive way to move forward.
And I think that's a very important mindset to have, because too often we can let the challenges overwhelm us and then we lull in frustration for longer than we really need to. But instead, if we flip the situation and we try to maybe at best set it aside and just keep doing what we're doing and keep reminding ourselves of why we're doing the research and what the inspiration is for us, it can become, in a way, a force that we can pass on, or lessons that we can pass on, and inspiration as well to our students.
And I guess part of it is also being able to be a strong woman in science and be able to show that I am capable, that women are capable, and that this is a really, positive thing to be able to show.
And in a way, you've really made a name for yourself in that space, in the work you do, but also as a woman scientist in Switzerland, you've won the Mari-Heimvögling Prize, which is one of the biggest prizes that you can get as a woman in science, and it's very prestigious. And I think that really shows your level of commitment to the work and the fact that none of these issues are going to put you down. You have a mission to do some good work, change the world, better the environment, and then pass it on to the younger generations. And I think that's that in itself is already a very inspiring story.
Oh, thanks.
So other than that sage advice of taking on the challenges head on, knowing you can pass on what you've learned to others, and I guess you also feel good when you can prove the naysayers wrong, what other advice can you offer to young scientists starting out?
So I think just be able to take a chance. So especially as a young scientist, if you really are just only doing something that is the status quo, you probably won't be able to make that big jump or leap to be able to be really well recognized and be able to continue in your scientific career, because this is such a competitive field. And so you really need to have the faith in yourself to take your idea and really bring it to the next level. And of course, maybe that will result in failure, but at least by trying to reach that, you are setting yourself up for the best possible success that you could have.
And failure is not necessarily anything bad. It's just that something that you thought would work didn't work, and you've learned something. There's always a learning lesson from failure, and we should stop looking at it as a really negative thing. I guess they always say reframe it as a learning experience rather than as the end of everything. But it's great advice. Where can people find you if they want to get in touch?
Yeah, so I'm on social media with LinkedIn and Twitter at Denise Mitrano. And you can also find our group website at www.ecam.ethz.ch.
And we'll definitely put that and links to a lot of different things that we've discussed today in the show notes so that listeners can get in touch and learn a lot more about you. But Denise, thank you so much. It's been a great discussion around a topic that I'm only just getting into, but I know has been very prevalent in the world and will become even more in future. Who knows where it's going to go? But like I do with every guest, I always give my guest a final message. So one last message for the listeners to take away from today.
Yeah, so as a final message, just try not to work so hard and be able to get away from your desk and get outside. Go out into the forest, get out into the mountains, go for a swim in the lake. Yeah, and enjoy yourself in open natural spaces. And yeah, enjoy this time so that you can get back refreshed to the rest of your work.
Thank you very much.
And that wraps up our eye-opening, inspiring and broad discussion with Denise Mitrano. For more information on good outdoor spots, cycling routes and camping challenges, a rundown on plastics terminology, or some tips on tackling the academic journey, check out the show notes for more information over at petermbach.com/podcast. And as always, thank you listeners for tuning into this episode and for your feedback and support. If you are enjoying this show, I would be incredibly grateful if you could share this podcast with your family, friends, colleagues, and even fellow environmentalists. Please also do subscribe or follow this podcast on Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you are listening from to be notified of the latest release as soon as it becomes available. If you are curious about me or my work in general, you can also check out my website or social media. Head to petermbach.com, my YouTube channel, Peter Marcus Bach, that's Marcus with a C, or follow me on X, formerly Twitter, at petermbach, or Instagram, at petermbach87. Feel free to reach out to me with any feedback or guest suggestions so that I can keep improving this show. The podcast's intro and outro song is called Starsky by Alex Kieran. Stay tuned for our next episode and next guest to hear how they are tackling the grand challenges.